Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man? They say murder three. Strange things that happen here. No stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree.
Welcome to Strange Things, broadcasting from the Arkanasa Radio Studios in Laredo, Texas. And welcome to the show. I'm your host, Chris James. Tonight we're going to be talking about the Spanish flu. But before I get started, recently I began driving for one of those not a taxi service companies. It's working out pretty well. I work on the show, and once in a while somebody calls asking for a ride. Not getting rich, but I'm bringing in a few extra bucks, which always helps. I wanted to say howdy to some of my passengers that I've talked to. However, by this time I've talked to so many folks, I can't possibly mention them all. Omar, he stands out. A JT from New Zealand was very interesting. Elizabeth, I hope you're doing okay. About 60% of my passengers are truck drivers, and so I'd like to say, keep up the good work. Some of the Tecolote baseball team rode with me the other day. The other passengers are a mix of folks who work in restaurants, stores, banks, and security guards. Well, also there are the folks struggling with addictions. All I can say for y'all is hang in there. There's a brighter future coming if you just keep going. I get a kick out of some of the dirty looks I get from cab drivers. They act as if I'm stealing their rides. The folks that use the not a taxi service aren't the kind to use a taxi. They can't afford the expense of paying $20 to go just a few miles. I drove a cab way back, and I know what that's like. If I've given you a ride, I hope you enjoyed it. I might keep doing this for some time if it keeps working out like it has. Just about everyone has heard about the Spanish flu. I've talked about it on the show a few times. I never did an entire show just on this one disease, so I thought it was about time to look into the deadly and unmanageable outbreak. Influenza, more commonly known as the flu, is an infectious disease caused by the influenza virus, which has the designation of H number, N number, such as H1N1. The symptoms can be mild to severe. The most common symptoms include a fever, runny nose, sore throat, muscle pains, the headache, and a cough, as well as the feeling of being tired. You don't die from the flu. The flu will cause you to feel horrible for a few days, and then your body will fix things. If while suffering from the flu you don't take steps to take care of yourself, you will develop pneumonia. That is what's going to kill you. Your lungs fill with fluids that your body can't handle, and you're literally drowned in your own bodily fluids. The highest group that are at risk are very old folks and the very young. In 1913, the Serbians wanted to become liberated from the rule of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Revolutionaries began conspiring to fight for their freedom. Lots of small uprisings broke out all over the country. Revolutionaries would spring up and fire a few shots and then run away and hide. The non-participants would wind up paying the price of retribution by the government. The Austrian-Hungarian Empire had no plans to allow this part of their domain to escape. The secret society, Union of Dead, came up with a plan to assassinate Archduke Ferdinand, who was the heir to the throne of Austria. Ferdinand was scheduled to visit Sarajevo, Bosnia, in June of 1914. This was their best chance to kill a member of the ruling elite and kick off their revolution. Gavrilo Principi was to wait on the side of the road and shoot the prince when the opportunity arose. The route of travel for the Archduke's motorcade was announced in the newspapers. Princip simply had to stand on the sidewalk and wait. The motorcade approached, but Princip was unable to get close enough to take a shot. He could only stand there and watch as his intended victim was coming close and then was driving away. Well, now things get a bit strange. The motorcade dropped the Archduke off at his destination. Then it was announced the motorcade was going to take the exact same route back to their beginning point, the hotel where the Archduke and his family were staying. Princip went back to the same corner, only this time he stood right at the very edge of the curb. As the motorcade drew near, it slowed down, and then it stopped right in front of the assassin. Princip moved in close and opened fire. His bullets hit both the Archduke and his wife, killing them both. How convenient that the car stopped right in front of the killer. It would almost seem as if somebody in the Austrian side of the deal wanted to start a war. Or could it have been some other, more secret society that wanted to end the European empires? The Austria-Hungarian Empire was the largest political entity in mainland Europe. It spanned almost 700,000 square kilometers and occupied much of Central Europe. Just about everything from the Tyrol region of northern Italy to the plains of Ukraine and the Transylvanian mountains of Eastern Europe. 11 major ethnic groups were scattered around the empire. There were Germans, Hungarians, Polish, Czech, Ukrainian, Slovak, Slovene, Croatians, Serbs, Italians, and Romanians. Like Germany, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was a state comprised of differing people and cultures. The empire had been formed in 1867 by a compromise agreement between Vienna and Budapest. Some say the Masons wanted to get rid of both the Austrian-Hungarian Empire and the German Empire. This would have made controlling Europe so much easier. The Masons have been blamed for just about every revolution in history. There is a very real possibility they were involved in most of them. Killing the ruling class never did much to start a war. There were so many princes and dukes waiting for their chance at the throne. Most of the time, the assassins were working for one member of the family or several. The best way to get a war started was to kill somebody high up the food chain and then make it look like the entire country was involved. Once the Archduke was dead, steps were taken to make it look as if all of Bosnia and the Serbs were involved. Other folks will tell you Germany wanted an excuse to invade the surrounding countries to expand their empire. They had a treaty saying if Austria-Hungary went to war, Germany would follow. Then there's the whole chemical industry. The companies had been stockpiling the chemicals needed to manufacture gunpowder for years. The trouble with making any kind of product, you need a customer to sell your product to. With tons of munitions sitting in warehouses all over the world, it was time to start a war so these perishables could be sold and not go to waste. And then there's everyone's favorite conspiracy target, international bankers. The Rothschild banking giant was ready to make huge loans to both sides of the war in the hopes of bringing in huger profits. There were branches of the Rothschild banking giant in Germany, Austria, France, England, Italy, and the United States. Once the Crown Prince was dead, Austria-Hungary made all kinds of demands on the Serbs that they knew going in would not be complied with. So Austria declared war on Serbia. Germany was supposed to talk to Russia and keep them out of the mix. Back in those days, just about every ruler of every country in Europe was either a brother, sister, or a cousin. The Tsar of Russia was the cousin of the King of England. The Kaiser of Germany was the cousin of the Queen of Holland. Everyone who was a king, queen, prince, or princess was related somehow. When Austria began shelling Belgrade, Serbia, Russia stepped in on the side of the Serbs. Germany sent word to Russia asking them to stay out or else. When Russia refused, Germany joined Austria in their small war with Serbia. France had a treaty saying any hostilities against Serbia would bring them into the war. England had a treaty with France, which caused the British to side with Serbia as well. Now you had England, France, Russia, and Serbia all fighting Austria, Hungary, Romania, and Germany. Spain had said no way. They wanted to stay out of the war. They declared themselves to be neutral. Meanwhile, in the United States, President Wilson swore we would never participate in the European conflict. It was their war. Let them fight it. He said over and over, American blood would not be spilled to fight a European war. Well, let's face it. War is very profitable. As long as you're sitting at home manufacturing guns and bombs and bullets, and not the one having to use these things, there's a lot, and I mean a lot, of money to be made. There are also the manufacturers of uniforms and trucks, the guys who build ships and airplanes. All of these folks are chomping at the bit, wanting to get involved in this massive money-making war. But Wilson said, no, we're going to sit this one out. Well, thousands of American men went to Algeria and enlisted in the French Foreign Legion. So many, in fact, the Legion had 3 battalions of nothing but American soldiers. Only the officers were French. This led to a lot of confusion. So all the NCOs had to be fluent in both French and English, or at least somewhat knowledgeable. Did I mention war is very profitable? Lots of money is to be made as long as you keep yourself out of the line of fire. Folks in the United States began holding private conversations on how to get the U.S. involved in the war so they could rake in some of that money. It would take some kind of a huge, bloody occurrence to justify the president going against his campaign promise. But back then, politicians tried to at least pretend they were honest. It would take some kind of a heinous act by the Germans to allow the U.S. to join the fray. Something like, say, sinking a passenger liner. The Lusitania was scheduled to depart from New York en route to England in May 1915. The war profiteers got their chance when a German sub sank the Lusitania. Well, this ship had been listed as a passenger ship, but it was also an auxiliary cruiser in the British Navy, and it was armed with anti-aircraft guns as well as deck guns. It was transporting munitions for the British to to be used against the Germans and the Austrians. The German government had put a notice in the newspapers saying not to sail on the ship because it was a fair target. But how do you get a war going if you don't get somebody killed? The Lusitania was sunk, and 128 of the 139 U.S. citizens aboard the ship died. Wilson got busy yelling about how the United States simply had to go to war against Germany. Let the profits roll in. The U.S. entered the war and began sending men and equipment overseas. The newspapers began printing stories on how it was every man's patriotic duty to sign up and go. Anyone not willing to join the Army, Navy, or Marine Corps was considered to be a traitor to his country. All the military forts and camps were packed with men being trained and prepared for war. You'd get your basic shooting and stabbing classes, and then board a train en route to New York. From there, they'd be shipped to England and then on to whichever trench was needing soldiers. In 1917, at Fort Riley, Kansas, a bunch of soldiers came down with some strange sickness. They lined up at sick call and were seen by the Army doctors. Headaches, nausea, muscle aches, tired feeling. Aspirin was handed out by the handful and men sent back to their barracks. It was believed they had either war jitters or maybe a slight case of a cold or a flu. Soon the men became much sicker. High fevers followed by listlessness and coma. Some of them began to die. The Army didn't think anything was really wrong. People get sick and die, especially in times of war. Maybe this was some kind of a foodborne illness, or perhaps a case of pneumonia. Some said it was aspirin poisoning. The soldiers that were in close quarters with the men who died were told to not say anything about what had happened. The war was still on, and this was considered national security. The men sharing the barracks were shipped out to surrounding forts, and then eventually they were sent overseas. As they moved from fort to station to port, they came in contact with thousands of unsuspecting people. The soldiers joined their fellow combatants in the trenches of the battlegrounds. Men would move from place to place. They had contact with soldiers and civilians from all the countries fighting on their side. On occasion, prisoners would be taken. The prisoners had to be searched, checked for weapons or secret documents, then transported to a holding area. These men from the other side were exposed to the men who were carrying the deadly virus that had started out back in Fort Riley, Kansas. Once interred at a POW camp, steps would be taken to repatriate the prisoners. It cost a lot of money to hold all those thousands of men in camps all across Europe. It was far easier and less expensive to get them to swear they'd stay out of the military and then send them home to whichever country they'd come from. Some of the returning prisoners were now carrying the virus with them. The bugs were slipping into all walks of life. As men began to get sick and die, the high command began to suspect foul play. This had to be some kind of a German sabotage. It must be a secret weapon no one had ever dreamed of. The steps were taken to find out what was being used to destroy the military personnel. By this time, civilians were getting sick and dying as well. This was still being blamed on the enemy. Bodies were beginning to pile up, more so than just from the war casualties. It was becoming harder and harder to keep the lid on what was going on. Estaples, France was a major troop staging area and a hospital where sick and wounded soldiers were brought from the front. With hundreds of thousands of men being shipped in and out every day, diseases were able to spread out in all directions. Spain had declared themselves neutral at the very beginning of hostilities. They said they had nothing to gain by joining either side. With people moving about Europe, it was only a short time before folks in Spain began becoming sick and dying. Not being aligned with either side, Spain didn't issue a gag order on their press. The newspapers in Spain began running headlines about young people suddenly becoming sick and dying. With the news blackout in England and the United States, no one had heard anything about any kind of a new disease. But then, word came from Spain saying they were in the middle of a crisis. Thousands of young men and women were sick, and many of them were not recovering. The bodies were growing at an alarming rate. The idea was that the disease was only in Spain. People began to refer to the disease as being the Spanish disease or the Spanish flu. Then it looked as if it was somehow spread to the United States. It had to have been some foreigner that came over on a boat and spread their nasty sickness among the folks here on the other side of the pond. This fit in with the government's wishes. The idea that this disease was brought over was far better than it might have started out here. Well, panic began to sink in. The numbers of sick was becoming so great hospitals had to set up emergency wards in all manner of location. Old warehouses, tents, office buildings, any place with lots of room to set up hospital beds. Soon, the barracks and military compounds were being utilized for patient storage. No one knew what to do as far as treatment went. All they could do was isolate the patient, feed them, give them support, and wait. They would either get better on their own or they'd die. As the war continued in Europe, huge numbers of people would move from one country to the next. Trains filled with either troops being shuffled from one end of the front to the other or civilians trying to get out of the area of conflict would travel about in search of someplace safe to live. No one ever bothered to tell people that felt sick to stay home and don't travel. Anytime a person was in a crowded location, the chances of contacting somebody with the flu was enormous. The Spanish flu moved from one end of the world to the other. Many thousands of people became sick and died. The thing about any disease is the virus or bacteria has a tendency to mutate. If you're exposed to a particular strain of flu and your immune system kicks in and you survive, you're immune to that strain from then on. You've been inoculated by having been exposed to the disease. As the Spanish flu moved from one end of Europe to the next and then into Asia or the Middle East, it began to change. It took on new and more deadly attributes. It grew stronger with time. The sick and injured soldiers were sent back home to recover. They were shipped to England, France, Canada, the United States. German and Austrian soldiers began arriving home with this unknown disease. The French Foreign Legion was stationed out of Algeria, and many troops wound up in northern Africa. Once there, they had contact with people around them who then moved on to other parts of the continent. With each new day, the numbers of sick and dying grew. The people had no idea what to do to maintain their own health. Some tried face masks, just a few layers of cloth to keep the microscopic bugs out of their lungs. The flu passed from the United States and Europe. The people all believed it had run its course. Most of the fatalities were buried, and the sick had managed to recover. People got on with their lives, thinking this had just been a fluke. With that, we're going to take a brief pause and play a couple of commercials, so don't go away. We'll be right back after this. You're listening to Arkanasa Radio. Are you taking care of your skin, or are you going to wait and see how time treats you? Take care today by contacting Lourdes James, Independent Beauty Consultant, at 956-723-3019. Don't let time get the best of you. Coffee makes the world go round. And around here, we have the Organic Man Coffee Trike, 4501 McPherson, Suite number 9. If you're not looking for coffee, try their tea. It's the best in town. And remember, life is too short to drink bad coffee. If your vision isn't what it used to be, and you're not sure you're seeing Bigfoot or just your neighbor mowing his lawn, stop on by Del Norte Optical, 107 Calle del Norte, just across the street from the Embassy Suites. You should be able to see what you're looking at. Did you hear a bump in the night and you think it just might be a ghost? Contact the Laredo Paranormal Research Society at laredoparanormal@hotmail.com. That's the LPRS for all your otherworldly needs. You're listening to Strange Things with Chris James. And welcome back to the show. We're talking about the Spanish flu. Russia had gone through a coup, not a revolution like most folks will say. It was a military takeover. The Soviets utilized the Russian Navy to overthrow the Tsar. The people of Russia had very little to do with any of the fighting or change in government. It was all a military action. A revolution is when the people rise up and take over the government of their country. In Russia, the military, as in the Navy, overthrew the ruling folks named the Romanovs. Lenin and Trotsky used the military to do their bidding, but it still wasn't a revolution. December 1917, the Bolsheviks signed a treaty with Germany. The treaty said Russia would stop supporting the Allies. They had to pay 300 million rubles to get their POWs back, and they surrendered Poland and the Ukraine to Germany. Now the German military could switch from a two-front war to just focusing on one. Everything could now be focused on defeating German and Austrian armies. With the United States now sending masses of men and materials to the battlefield, the Germans were being pushed back. 1918, the war continued to take lives at an unheard of rate. The stalemate of the trench warfare was slowly beginning to move to the side of the U.S., British, French armies. With the introduction of a new and mighty secret weapon called the tank in September 1916, during the Battle of the Somme, the High Command thought the war was theirs. Of the 35 tanks that started the big push, only 5 managed to cross no man's land. It wasn't until 1918 that the tank was able to become a reliable enough weapon to make a change in the battlefield. The people started getting sick again. Now, this was odd. The flu was supposed to have run its course. It had moved on. There shouldn't be a second flu season so soon after the first one. This time it was a mutated version of the first outbreak. The symptoms came on twice as fast and twice as hard. The people would become sick and die in little to no time. The flu is a risk to people very young and very old, but this strain of flu was affecting people between 20 and 60 years of age. The folks who had already been stricken by the disease were immune, but that didn't save the thousands of people who had avoided becoming sick the first go-round. Thousands of new cases were showing up at hospitals all across the world. Even countries that had avoided the disease in the 1970s were being ravaged. Big cities were devastated as patients were showing up and overwhelming the medical facilities. Health officials had to find places to house them. Medical staff had to be safeguarded so they could attempt to treat the sick and dying. And it wasn't just the health field that was being stricken. As so many people failed to show up for work, businesses were being driven under, not by a lack of customers, but a lack of workers to fulfill their needs. Small towns began to barricade the roads leading in or out. The strangers were threatened with death if they tried to travel through town. Armed guards were trying to protect their families by any means available. The death toll took a sudden leap in October 1918. The deaths went from thousands to hundreds of thousands. It is estimated over 25% of all the people living in the United States contracted the disease, and 100 million people worldwide died from the outbreak. This was 5% of the total population of the planet. People on remote islands were affected, as were people in faraway isolated communities. Inuit living in isolated areas of the Arctic Circle died from this bizarre disease. In November, the numbers of dead and dying seemed to slow down. The world held its breath, waiting to see if this dreaded disease had run its course. It might have been the winter months, or it could have been the disease had mutated once more. For some unknown reason, the numbers began to dwindle. December was a Christmas gift to the world. People were still sick and dying, but nothing close to what had been going on in October. January 1918 showed no increase. The end of February, there was another spike in death. It was about half as many as in October, but still, this was in the thousands of dead. As March came to a close, the disease looked as if it had finally disappeared. People were still uneasy. Strangers were not welcome in some communities. Troops who had been released from the war found travel difficult. As the dead were being buried, health officials began looking for answers. Scientists tried to rush out new and bizarre theories as to where the Spanish flu had actually come from. One doctor said it was actually aspirin poisoning. The people were using aspirin by the handful. Not knowing what caused the outbreak, nobody could say for sure how to treat it. Aspirin became the go-to drug at the time. Invented in 1897, Bayer began distributing aspirin around the world in 1899. In case you've never looked into it, here is a brief history of aspirin. From 3000 to 1500 BC, The bark from the willow tree was used as a medicine by ancient civilizations like the Sumerians and the Egyptians. In 400 BC in Greece, Hippocrates administered willow leaf tea, which contains the natural compound from which aspirin is derived. It was used to ease the pain of childbirth. By 1763, the Royal Society published a report detailing 5 years of experiments on the use of dried, powdered willow bark in curing fevers. Then, in 1890, while working for pharmaceutical company Bayer, German chemist Felix Hoffmann found that adding an acetyl group to salicylic acid, it would reduce the irritant properties. He took his newfound medication to his bosses at the Bayer Drug Company and tried to get them to market it. But the boys at Bayer weren't all that enthusiastic about this new drug. No, they said it had too many possibilities for abuse. It was dangerous, and it was addictive. The Bayer Drug Company had found their own medication that was far superior to aspirin. In fact, their drug was going to cure the world of all of its ills. This new drug was so versatile, it was going to be the hero of all drugs. They were going to call it, drum roll please, heroin. Yes, the boys at Bayer had invented heroin to ease all the world's aches and pains. You could buy heroin at any chemist shop, what we call a pharmacy today. Heroin was used by millions to ease any aches and pains up until it became quite evident the folks were becoming addicted. And once they were trapped in this nasty web of addiction, they found it nearly impossible to get off this drug. The drug company found out aspirin, whereas they have no idea how it works, is actually quite mild compared to the great and wonderful drug that had become a blight on society today. Anybody want to say, oops? If you're running a slight fever and you use aspirin or other medications to drive the fever down, you'll wind up causing the virus to grow stronger. The fever is your body's defenses kicking in to kill off the invaders. As the virus grows in your system, it doesn't cause you any trouble. It does try to infect every cell in your body, but you don't notice it. Then your immune system kicks in. It senses an invader and sends in the troops to attack and wipe out the virus. As the immune system attacks the virus, it kills off any infected cells it comes in contact with. This is what causes you to have a sore throat, aching muscles, and upset stomach. By using drugs to lower the fever, you're preventing your defenses from doing their job. Only if the fever gets too high, best guess is about 104 or 105, should you begin to treat it. Some scientists suggested the prevalence of pigs kept at Fort Riley or in the vicinity might have caused the virus to jump from pigs to humans. They were likening the Spanish flu to the swine flu. In 1976, an outbreak, if you can call it that, of the swine flu at Fort Dix, New Jersey, caused 1 death and hospitalized 13. In the ensuing panic, it led to a mass immunization program. After the program began, the vaccine was rushed out and given to thousands of people here in the United States. Suddenly, over 500 people developed Guillain-Barré syndrome, which causes paralysis, respiratory arrest, and death. 25 of the people died, not from the flu, but the vaccine that had been rushed into production to prevent the flu. The immunization program was ended after approximately 25% of the population of the United States had been administered this vaccine. This was a typical knee-jerk reaction to a non-event. One person died from the flu and 25 from the cure. The people were still scared of the Spanish flu and they thought it might be making a comeback. Astronomers at the University of Wales say the Spanish flu was not caused by normal process of person-to-person contact. Instead, they blame the spread on the illness on solar activity, which then caused cosmic dust particles in the Earth's upper atmosphere to fall down to the ground, infecting people who came in contact with the dust. The Cardiff-based team, which was led by Professor Chandar Wickramanasinghe, believes that the dust had been deposited in the upper atmosphere when a comet passed near the Earth at some point in the past. The dust contained either the virus itself or the DNA molecules which then produced the flu bug once it was inside a host. People had inhaled minute particles into their lungs. The virus would then begin to grow, and it would then take over the host's body. Chandra Wickramasinghe is a Sri Lankan-born British mathematician, astronomer, and astrobiologist. His research interests include interstellar medium, infrared astronomy, light scattering theory, applications of solid-state physics to astronomy, the early solar system, comets, astrochemistry, the origins of life, and astrobiology. A student and collaborator of Fred Hoyle, the pair worked jointly for over 40 years as influential proponents of panspermia. If you never watch Ancient Aliens, panspermia is the belief that life evolved here on Earth after microscopic elements were transported here by either comets or aliens and grew into human. In 1974, they proposed the hypothesis that some dust in the interstellar space was largely organic. Later, this was proven to be correct. The team at Cardiff also say their solar theory was responsible for other outbreaks besides the 1917-18 epidemic of Spanish flu. Their report, called The Dilemma of Influenza, was published in the journal Current Science. Professor Wickramasinghe claimed the theory could also help health managers prepare for a major outbreak of a new disease. It could help predict epidemics because there is a very short space in time between a peak in solar activity and the effects reaching us here on the Earth, he said. It has never been proven that a virus such as the flu can be passed from one person to another, said Professor Wickramasinghe. Instead, we believe these outbreaks are caused by particles in the stratosphere coming down to the Earth's surface. What we are getting from the high atmosphere, be it a virus or genetic trigger, is significantly more dangerous than anything we catch from other people, he added. Now, if you listen to the show, we said the first recorded cases of the disease were at Fort Riley, Kansas. That is the first written report. There were people getting sick in many places. Some actually had the flu. Some had food poisoning, which on outset looks a lot like the flu. There is no such thing as a 24-hour flu. It's actually food poisoning. There were reports of people becoming sick and dying all over the world, all at about the same time. Could this Spanish flu have actually been a world outbreak brought to us from the stars? In 1969, the Apollo 12 astronauts recovered a camera from a small satellite named the Surveyor 3. It had been orbiting the moon, taking pictures, and ultimately it had landed on the moon's surface in one of NASA's many experiments. Back on Earth in a clean room, technicians discovered a colony of microbes in the camera lens that had apparently survived 3 years in outer space as well as on the surface of the moon. So yes, bacteria and viruses can survive in outer space. In 2004, the CDC decided they simply had to mess about with the Spanish flu virus. They dug up the bodies of some Inuit people who had died in 1918. The bodies had been buried in the permafrost and they were frozen, so the virus was still alive inside of them. Oh, great! Let's go dig up some nasty virulent bug. I'm sure nothing will go wrong. Anytime folks begin poking around in extremely dangerous things, they think they know how to handle things and all the possible mistakes have been taken care of. In February 2005, scientists working in a Level 4 biohazard lab, that's the highest level of hazard they have, they were about to exit the room. They stepped into the decontamination shower and waited for the chemicals to wash away any microscopic hazards from their suits. Instead of being sprayed with disinfectants, the airlock door decompressed and the door began to open. The scientists, knowing the room was awash in deadly microbes, held the door shut. They called the control room and asked for help. The door into the Level 4 lab popped open. Now the scientists had to hold both doors shut while waiting for somebody to do something to keep the contagions away from the entire human race. They managed to get the chemical sprays to function at last. They had to pump them manually, and they washed off the scientists' suits. Then they had to address the door issue. It turns out the computer program that controlled all their safety equipment was faulty. Then the CDC discussed whether or not they should report what just happened. They didn't want to report the occurrence because it wasn't the first time they'd had a life and death incident. They had nearly released biohazards into the air of Atlanta on more than one occasion. One time, they sent a Level 4 hazard to a Level 1 lab and left it there. On another occasion, a scientist leaving a Level 3 lab couldn't get the shower to work, so she just skipped it. Went into the locker room, took a regular shower, and changed and went home. The CDC said there was hardly any reason to worry. It was still a Level 3 biohazard lab. The CDC scientists took some shortcuts and accidentally sent samples of a deadly bird flu virus to the Department of Agriculture laboratory. A report from the Center for Disease Control and Prevention said somehow the wrong sample was sent out. According to the Washington Post, the CDC intended to ship a relatively benign animal strain to a poultry research laboratory of the Department of Agriculture. Unfortunately, a deadly strain of the avian flu virus was sent instead. In May 2007, the lab where the deadly Q fever was being played with, Q fever is also called quarry fever. It's a bacterial infection caused by Coxella brunetti. The bacteria are most commonly found in cattle, sheep, and goats around the world. Humans typically get Q fever when they breathe in dust that has been contaminated by infected animals. While doing some routine research, the sample was accidentally dropped on the floor, scattering the microbes everywhere. The solution was to evacuate the lab and duct tape the door shut. Yes, indeed, a $6 roll of duct tape was used to secure a multi-million-dollar high-security biohazard lab. So the guys at the CDC who keep having accidents that they then fail to report are working with the virus that caused the Spanish flu. What can possibly go wrong? They still don't know for sure what caused the Spanish flu to be so virulent and kill so many people. They don't even know if it was actually a flu virus or something else. The people wishing to study the virus should stop and think, do they really need to run such an enormous risk just so they can say they know what the Spanish flu really was? And you know, somewhere out there, someone is working to turn this deadly bug into a weapon. They'll say they have to make a weapon out of it because someone else out there is trying to do the same thing. Didn't need to answer that anyway. They say that somebody somewhere out there is trying to do the same thing. We have to have the bug bomb because they will have it. If we make it first, we'll know how to handle it should some foreign country attack us using bioterrorism. Or should some sloppy lab worker accidentally drop the sample or accidentally send them out in the mail. I hope you enjoyed tonight's show and found the information interesting, if not a little terrifying. If you have a subject you'd like to hear on the show, or you have a personal story you want to share, I won't mention your name if you don't want it on the air. You can email me at strangethings@arkanasa.com. You can find the archives at strangethings.podomatic.com. If you enjoyed tonight's show, be sure and tell your friends. We can always use the free advertising. Makeup isn't something you want to just smear on and hope for the best. You might come out looking like Lon Chaney. Call Lourdes James, independent beauty consultant, and get a free makeover to see how makeup should be done. 956-723-3019. Back in 1776, someone said, "Give me coffee or give me death." And if that's how you feel, you should be at the Organic Man Coffee Truck. They make coffee the right way, one delicious cup at a time. 4501 McPherson, Suite number 9. Coffee, the stuff dreams are made of. Did you go out UFO hunting and couldn't focus on the sky? Swing on by Del Norte Optical, 107 Calle Del Norte, right across from the Embassy Suites. That's not a weather balloon, that's a flying saucer.
Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man, they say murder 3? Strange things that happen here, how stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree?